sure everything is secure before we depart?
Yes, Your Majesty.
The square outside the palace was unusually still. Tourists held their cameras high. Children pressed against the railing, and the sound of boots on cobblestone echoed in perfect rhythm. Every eye was fixed on the towering figure in scarlet uniform, a royal guard, face locked in discipline, rifle resting against his shoulder. Then, without warning, the crowd parted. A black car rolled up to the gates, its doors opening with a sense of entitlement. From it emerged Queen Camilla, chin high, eyes sharp, her every step demanding attention. She was not scheduled for a ceremony. There was no parade. Yet her presence carried the heavy expectation of privilege. She stopped just inches from the guard, her voice slicing through the hushed silence. "You salute me." The words were not a request, they were a command. The crowd froze, stunned. Some gasped, some fumbled with their phones to record. The guard, however, did not flinch. His jaw tightened, but his eyes hidden behind the brim of his bearskin hat remained locked forward. "UNMOVING." Camilla leaned closer, her tone laced with irritation. "Do you know who I am? You will salute me." Still, nothing. The guard stood like stone, the embodiment of centuries of tradition. He was trained to salute only in moments dictated by strict protocol. His silence was not disobedience, it was loyalty. Loyalty to duty, to honor, and to every soldier who came before him. The tension thickened. A child in the crowd whispered, "Why won't he move?" A veteran muttered under his breath, "Because he knows the rules." The air felt electric, as if history itself was holding its breath. Camilla's face reddened. She raised her hand, gesturing sharply, trying to break his composure. Reporters zoomed in, eager for scandal. The guard's hands gripped his rifle tighter, but his body remained unshaken. And then, the moment that stunned the world, Camilla stepped directly into his path. She expected him to cave, to bow, to bend before her title. Instead, what followed would echo across headlines and social media feeds worldwide, that the crowd thought he would step aside. But, in the next instant, they would see what honor truly means. The courtyard buzzed with uneasy whispers, but for the guard, the world around him faded into silence. He was not merely a figure in a red coat. Behind the stiff posture and the shadow of his bearskin hat lived a man who carried memories heavier than the rifle on his shoulder. His name was Sergeant Thomas Hale, though few would ever know it. Guards like him were trained to be faceless symbols of duty, never personalities. Yet inside him, every heartbeat echoed with the promise he had once made to a fallen brother years earlier. In the sweltering heat of Afghanistan, Thomas had stood on a dusty road beside his closest friend, Corporal James Harlow. The day had begun like so many others: patrol, banter, the heavy weight of armor, and the distant hum of uncertainty. Then came the blast. The ground shook violently, flames erupted, and in seconds everything turned into smoke and screams. Thomas survived. Though shrapnel tore through his arm, James did not. Thomas remembered kneeling in the rubble, clutching his friend's dog tags, whispering through cracked lips, "I will stand tall for you. Always." That vow carried him home, shaping every step, every salute, every unbroken moment of silence. When he was selected for duty as a royal guard, he accepted not as a reward but as a responsibility. To the tourists, his stillness might have seemed like routine, but for Thomas it was sacred. Each motionless hour was a tribute to James and to every soldier who never returned. To break that silence for anything less than true duty would feel like betrayal. That was why, on this afternoon, when Queen Camilla stood before him demanding a salute, he chose immobility. His body remained iron because his promise was stronger than any voice of authority. Camilla, however, carried a very different history. Her journey into royalty had been long, controversial, and often scorned. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to the weight of her title, 2 doors opening before she even touched them, 2 heads bowing the instant she appeared. Respect, in her world, was automatic, drawn not from sacrifice but from position. On this day, her demand for recognition was less about protocol and more about power. When she commanded the guard to salute, it was not ceremony she sought, but affirmation of her authority. The courtyard itself added to the weight of the moment. The palace gates were more than stone and iron, they were symbols. Beneath those cobblestones lay centuries of marches, salutes, and silent vigils for monarchs past. Every step of every guard carried echoes of history. To bend those rules here was not a trivial gesture. It was a crack in the very foundation of tradition. That was why Thomas's refusal was not insolence, it was loyalty, it was honor. The crowd sensed the tension like a storm gathering above. Their heads, tourists shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they were witnessing a guard overstepping his bounds or a royal overstepping hers. Children whispered questions their parents couldn't answer. Some reached for their phones, recording every moment, knowing instinctively that this was not ordinary. A few veterans in the crowd recognized it instantly. One older man in a wheelchair leaned forward, eyes narrowed, and muttered under his breath, "Stand your ground, son, don't you dare give in." Thomas's mind, though outwardly calm, swirled with memory. He heard James's voice as if it were alive inside him. "You don't move for pride, you move for duty." His grip on his rifle tightened, the wood firm against his palm. Every muscle in his body begged him to shift, to react, but his training and his vow held him still. He could feel the weight of eyes pressing down on him, yet he reminded himself that his loyalty was not to faces or titles. It was to the crown, as an institution, to history, to the blood of men who had stood before him. Camilla's eyes flashed with disbelief. To her, silence was disrespect. To her, a guard ignoring a queen was unacceptable. Each second of stillness deepened her humiliation. Her voice sharpened as she repeated herself, louder this time, her words slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. "Salute me." It was less a request than a demand. But underneath her stern tone lingered something else, anxiety. For the first time in years, perhaps in decades, she felt powerless. And powerlessness was a feeling she could not tolerate. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Some onlookers believed the guard would eventually cave. Others whispered that he might face punishment if he didn't. But the veterans knew better. They knew that the guards were not puppets of vanity. They were embodiments of centuries-old duty. Breaking formation here, saluting outside protocol, was not respect, it was weakness. For Thomas, the moment became larger than himself. He was no longer just Sergeant Hale standing in front of a queen. He was every soldier who had stood the line, every comrade who had fallen, every voice that whispered from beneath foreign soil. His stillness was his tribute. His silence was his oath. And so he stood, immovable, though his heart pounded and his breath was steady only by force of will. The standoff stretched on. Cameras flashed. Children gasped. Veterans clenched their fists in solidarity. Camilla's face burned with frustration as she realized the guard's refusal was not bending. What she could not know yet was that this moment was only the beginning. Her pride would not allow her to stop here. She would push harder, crossing lines that no one thought she would dare. And when she did, Thomas Hale's response would ripple far beyond this courtyard, leaving an imprint that the world would not soon forget. The courtyard seemed to shrink under the weight of the silence. All around, the air buzzed with tension, every breath, every shifting footstep magnifying the standoff between the queen and the soldier. Thomas Hale stood locked in place, his body as rigid as the rifle he held. Across from him, Queen Camilla's eyes glimmered with irritation, her demand unanswered. For most, such a refusal would have been enough of a warning, but her pride would not let her retreat. Instead, it drove her forward. She leaned closer, her voice sharp, carrying through the crowd. "You dare ignore me," she hissed. Her words, filled with disbelief. "I am your queen. You will salute me." Gasps rippled through the tourists. A young boy tugged at his mother's hand, whispering, "Why won't he do it?" The mother shook her head, whispering back, "Because he isn't allowed." A few phones were raised higher, red recording lights blinking. People knew instinctively that something extraordinary was unfolding before them, something that might soon ignite headlines around the world. The guard did not move. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, stayed forward. Inside, Thomas's heart pounded, but his discipline was stronger. He remembered the endless hours drilled into him. Do not break, do not falter. You are the line between chaos and tradition. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. The refusal stung her pride, but it was the gathering audience that deepened her anger. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the cameras capturing her vulnerability. Royals were not supposed to be challenged in public. She straightened her shoulders, her voice rising louder now, so the entire courtyard could hear. "You cannot honor your queen," she declared. "Then perhaps you do not deserve the uniform you wear." The words hit like a blade. Veterans in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, muttering angrily among themselves. One man in medals barked out, "He's honoring more than you'll ever understand." The murmur spread, dividing the audience. Some sided with the queen, whispering that defying her was unacceptable, while others clenched their fists in solidarity with the soldiers' stillness. Children shrank back, frightened by the rising tension. Tourists glanced at one another, uncertain if this was a confrontation or some strange display of royal pageantry. But those who knew the rules Those who had served recognized it for what it was, a test of loyalty, not to a person, but to principle. Camilla, feeling the pushback in the air, took a step closer. Her heels clicked against the stone as she moved directly into Thomas's space. She stared up at him, her voice lowering to a venomous whisper meant only for his ears. "Do you know what happens to those who defy me?" Thomas did not flinch. His jaw tightened. Every nerve in his body screamed for release, but he remembered the vow he had made in Afghanistan. He remembered James lying lifeless in the sand, and the promise he had whispered, "I will stand tall for you." That promise was greater than fear, greater than threat, greater than the woman who now stood before him demanding submission. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. For Camilla, it became unbearable. She straightened, her face flushed red, and raised her voice again so the world could hear. "Salute me, or I will have you removed." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Removed. A guard dismissed for doing his duty. The absurdity of the threat sparked a wave of murmurs. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, every angle. This was no longer a quiet incident. This was spectacle, scandal. Still, Thomas did not move. His stillness became louder than her commands, his silence more powerful than her titles. The veterans in the crowd stood straighter, as if standing with him. One old soldier, voice cracking with age, shouted, "Stand firm, lad. Don't break for anyone." His cry was met with scattered applause, then more voices, until the courtyard buzzed with divided energies and cheering. Some jeering, all waiting for the breaking point. Camilla's pride could not allow her to back down, her hand lifted, sharp and commanding, as though she could order his body to move through sheer force of will. "You will salute," she demanded again, her tone trembling with fury. For the first time, Thomas shifted slightly, not to salute, but to adjust his grip on his rifle. The subtle movement was enough to send a shockwave through the crowd. Gasps erupted, cameras zoomed in, and for a heartbeat everyone thought he might finally cave. But then his hands locked back into place, his posture even firmer than before. Silence that followed was deafening. It was no longer just a standoff between a queen and her guard. It was a symbol of two worlds colliding, the entitlement of authority against the discipline of service. The longer it dragged on, the clearer it became that this was no mere argument. This was history being written in real time. Children clung tighter to their parents. Reporters whispered frantically to each other about how to frame the story. Some tourists lowered their cameras, too caught up in the raw tension to film. The air felt charged, as if the courtyard itself was holding its breath. Camilla's face twisted in frustration. She was not used to resistance, certainly not from someone meant to represent loyalty. And yet, here stood a man unmoved, unshaken, refusing to bend even as she bore down on him with the full weight of her crown. The humiliation cut deep. Her voice dropped raw with anger, as she spat, "You are nothing without me. This palace, this post, this uniform, your existence depends on me." Thomas felt the words like sparks against steel, but his silence held. Deep inside, his chest ached with memory. He saw James's face in the smoke of Afghanistan, heard the dying breath of a friend who had once told him, "Never let them break you." That was the true crown he served, the true weight he carried, not titles, not names, but sacrifice. That the courtyard trembled with anticipation. The veterans in the crowd now stood openly defiant, glaring at Camilla. Some tourists murmured their disapproval, while others shook their heads in disbelief. It was chaos around the edges, but at the center, Thomas remained a statue of calm. His stillness was more powerful than shouting, more defiant than rebellion. But Camilla's pride was not finished. She would push harder, she would cross a line that no one imagined she'd dare. And when she did, the silence that Thomas carried would explode into a moment so shocking, so unforgettable, that the world itself would stop to witness what discipline truly means. The courtyard had grown restless, a living storm of whispers, camera shutters, and anxious breaths. The air was heavy, not just with summer heat but with the unbearable tension of a queen demanding submission and a soldier refusing to yield. For long moments the silence of Sergeant Thomas Hale had been enough to defy her authority. But silence, in Camilla's eyes, had turned to mockery, and she would not be mocked. She stepped closer, her heels striking the stone with sharp authority, until she was nearly chest to chest with him. The brim of his tall bearskin hat cast his face in shadow, but she could feel his unshaken presence, like a wall refusing to move. Her voice, once measured, cracked with anger. "You think you can embarrass me before my people? You will regret this." The crowd murmured louder, sensing something about to break. Veterans clenched their fists. Tourists leaned forward, children hid behind their parents' legs. The guard still did not move. His stillness was a blade, cutting deeper into her pride with every heartbeat. Then, in a moment no one expected, Camilla lifted her hand and placed it on the barrel of his rifle. Gasps erupted through the courtyard. Phones tilted higher. Every soldier watching from the palace gates stiffened in disbelief. For centuries, the rifles of the guards had been symbols as much as weapons, extensions of their honor. To touch one uninvited was to cross a sacred boundary. Her hand lingered there, firm and deliberate, as though daring him to react. "You carry this because of me," she hissed, "and I can take it away in an instant." Inside Thomas's chest, something stirred. His training screamed at him to remain still, but the memory of Afghanistan burned hot in his veins. He remembered kneeling beside James, smoke filling the air, clutching a rifle almost identical to this one, knowing it had not been enough to save his friend. The weapon wasn't just steel and wood, it was a reminder of sacrifice, of brothers who never returned. And now, this woman treated it like a prop in her display of dominance. His jaw clenched. For the first time, the faintest tremor ran down his arm. The crowd caught it. A ripple of shock moved through them. "He's going to react," someone whispered. "Oh my God, he's going to move." Camilla, mistaking the tension for weakness, pressed further. She shoved the rifle ever so slightly, enough to jar the guard's balance, enough to show that she could touch what should have been untouchable. "Look at me when I speak," she demanded. A guard who cannot obey is no guard at all. That was the breaking point. With a sudden, deliberate motion, Thomas stamped his boot against the stone. The sound thundered through the courtyard like a gunshot. The crowd jumped, startled. The veterans straightened in awe. Camilla froze, eyes wide, her hand still resting on the rifle as she realized the soldier before her had shifted. Slowly, with precision born of discipline, Thomas swung his rifle back into its exact position. His head turned just slightly, enough that the shadow of his hat no longer completely covered his face. For the first time, the world caught a glimpse of his eyes, cold, steady, unshaken. He did not speak, but his message was clear. "Do not touch this again." The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a camera clicked, not a whisper broke the stillness. Every person in that courtyard felt the gravity of what had just happened. Camilla pulled her hand back, startled, but the humiliation cut deeper than her shock. She had touched him, shoved him, demanded from him, and he had responded not with words, not with surrender, but with a single act of controlled defiance that echoed, louder than any insult. But her pride was wounded beyond repair. Her lips curled, and in a reckless act of desperation, she reached again, not for the rifle this time, but for him. She shoved her palm against his chest, pushing against the scarlet uniform as though to prove she could break his immovable stance. The courtyard gasped as one, cameras flashed wildly. A child cried out, frightened by the sudden aggression. The veterans roared in outrage. Out of line, one bellowed, "Disgrace." Another shouted, "Dot," and then came the moment that would be replayed across the world. Thomas moved, not with anger, not with violence, but with precision. He snapped his boot down once more, the crack echoing like thunder, and shifted his rifle in a motion so fast, so disciplined, it sliced the air. In a single fluid step, he drew his weapon into the ready position, not aimed at her, never breaking protocol, but angled in perfect formation to signal warning. The sound of metal locking into place rang across the courtyard. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Camilla staggered back, her face pale, her chest heaving. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, she looked not powerful but small. The guard, still silent, still disciplined, had not laid a finger on her. He had not spoken a single word, yet his movement was louder than a shout, clearer than any insult. "This line will not be crossed." The tourists stared in awe, their cameras trembling in their hands. Children whispered to each other in wide-eyed wonder. The veterans stood tall, some with tears welling in their eyes, as though seeing their own vows honored through the young soldier before them. The silence stretched long, broken only by the pounding of hearts. Then, slowly, Thomas returned the rifle to his side. His body resumed the exact rigid posture of attention, as though nothing had happened. It was as if the brief storm of movement had been only a flash of lightning, leaving behind an even heavier stillness. Camilla's face burned with fury, but there was nothing more she could do. To push further would mean exposing herself before the world as a bully against a soldier of honor. She had crossed the line, and in his disciplined response, he had stripped her of the authority she thought unshakable. The crowd, frozen for so long, finally broke. Applause erupted, not wild, not chaotic, but steady, rising like a tide. It began with the veterans, then spread to the tourists, until the courtyard rang with clapping hands and murmured words of respect. A little girl at the front whispered, "He's a hero," her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around her, and through it all, Thomas stood unmoved, his silence unbroken, his vow intact. What had begun as a queen's demand had turned into a moment of living history. Her shove, her pride, her attempt to bend him, had instead revealed the unshakable strength of a soldier's oath. The world would soon see the footage, the photos, the headlines, but those who stood in that courtyard would never forget the sound of a boot striking stone, the glint of steel in the sun, and the unyielding stillness of a man who refused to bow. The applause swelled like a tide breaking against the palace walls. What had started with a few claps from veterans grew louder, steadier, until the entire courtyard seemed to echo with the sound of approval. Cameras trembled as they captured the moment, reporters whispering into microphones, their voices filled with awe and disbelief. And there in the center of it all, Thomas Hale stood motionless once again, as if carved from the very stone beneath. His boots, he had not spoken, had not shouted, had not raised his rifle in threat, yet his silence had crushed the pride of a queen. Camilla stood frozen a few feet away, her hand still tingling from where it had pressed against his chest. Her face flushed crimson, not with power but with humiliation. She turned toward the crowd, only to find eyes filled not with sympathy, but with judgment. The veterans glared openly, their chins high, their pride reflected in the soldier who had just defended the sanctity of their oath. Even the tourists, once confused, now seemed to understand. Respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned. For the first time in her reign, Camilla felt the sting of public rejection. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Every attempt, at command, every ounce of authority, felt suddenly meaningless before the sheer weight of one man's silence. Then, in a moment almost theatrical in its timing, palace officials moved quickly from the sidelines. A colonel in dress uniform, face grim, pushed through the crowd with urgency. He approached Thomas, not with anger, but with solemn respect. He knew what had just happened. He knew the cameras had caught everything, and he knew the guard had not broken his vow. The colonel gave a crisp nod, his voice low but clear enough to be heard by those closest. "Stand your ground, Sergeant. You did your duty." The veterans erupted in louder applause, some even saluting from the crowd. A man in a wheelchair raised trembling fingers to his brow, his salute shaking but steady in spirit. Camilla's humiliation deepened. This was not just defiance. This was the entire courtyard choosing the guard over her. She had sought submission, but instead, she was left isolated, a symbol of pride undone. Her hand twitched at her side as though tempted to lash out again, but the weight of the stairs, the cameras, the murmurs of history being made, froze her in place. Thomas remained still, his eyes forward, his posture flawless. The chaos swirled around him, but he was unmoved. In that stillness lay the lesson no words could teach. Discipline was greater than ego. Honor greater than power. The colonel stepped back, letting the silence settle again. Then, in perfect formation, Thomas shifted once more, returning his rifle to its side. The precision of the movement, so sharp, so controlled, drew gasps from the crowd. It was as though he were closing a chapter, punctuating the moment with the very discipline that defined him. Camilla, unable to bear the humiliation any longer, turned sharply on her heel. Her black car rolled forward, doors opening to swallow her pride. She climbed in without another word, her face pale, her posture stiff. As the vehicle pulled away, the courtyard seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving into a storm of claps, cheers, and tears. Reporters shouted questions into the air. "Sergeant, why didn't you salute? What message do you have for the Queen? Do you realize the world is watching?" But Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was the message. His stillness was the answer. The veterans understood. The children felt it. The tourists would carry the story home, and in the hours to come, the footage would sweep across the internet, clips replayed endlessly, headlines screaming of humiliation, honor, and a guard who stood firm when pressed by a queen. One image, in particular, would become iconic. Snapshot of Sergeant Hale in scarlet, rifle locked at his side, his eyes just visible under the shadow of his hat, staring forward with the unyielding calm of a man who had faced death and refused to bow. It would spread across front pages, social media feeds, and history books, not as rebellion, but as proof that tradition was not weakness. As the cheers carried through the courtyard, Thomas stood unshaken. He was not basking in glory. He was not savoring victory. In his mind he was back in Afghanistan, kneeling beside James Harlow in the sand, whispering the promise that had carried him here. He stood not for applause, not for headlines, but for that vow unbroken. And so, even as the Queen retreated, humiliated, and the world erupted around him, Sergeant Thomas Hale resumed his post. His rifle gleamed, his boots pressed against the stone, his eyes fixed forward. The chaos had come and gone, but the guard remained silent, still unmoved. The courtyard, once tense with confrontation, now hummed with a different energy. The black car that carried Camilla away disappeared beyond the gates, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. The cheers and claps from the crowd slowly faded into murmurs, but the weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air like a memory too powerful to leave. Sergeant Thomas Hale remained at his post, body rigid, eyes forward, the rifle a steady extension of his arm. To the untrained eye he looked exactly as he had at the start, motionless, silent, unreadable. But within him, a storm of memory and meaning rumbled. He thought of James again, the dust of Afghanistan, the promise whispered into smoke. In this moment, it felt as though his vow had finally found its purpose. From the crowd, a child's voice broke the hush, soft, innocent, and clear enough for those near to hear. "He's a hero," the little girl whispered. The words traveled, like ripples across water, carried from one ear to another until the idea seemed to settle over the entire courtyard. Hero, not rebel, not disobedient hero. A colonel in dress uniform stepped forward again, this time slower, his expression softened. He stopped just a few paces from Thomas and, after a long pause, raised his hand in a crisp salute. The gesture was deliberate, heavy with meaning. The crowd fell silent again, watching as one soldier of high rank honored another who had not moved a muscle. For Thomas, the salute was more than recognition. It was validation not just of his action today, but of his entire journey, his vow, his sacrifice. He did not return the salute. His discipline would not allow it. But inside, something eased. James would have smiled at this, he thought. The veterans in the crowd stood straighter, some raising shaky salutes of their own. A man in a wheelchair wiped his eyes. Another whispered, "That lad just reminded the whole world what service means." Thomas's posture never faltered, but his mind wandered briefly to his locker back at the barracks, where a worn pair of dog tags hung from a nail. James's tags, the ones he carried back from the desert. He imagined himself holding them tonight, running his thumb across the letters worn into the metal, feeling the quiet connection to a brother long gone. He would whisper the same words he always did. "I stood tall, I kept my promise." The courtyard slowly began to disperse. Tourists left buzzing with stories they would retell for years. Reporters hurried away, already crafting headlines. Children asked endless questions their parents struggled to answer. And through it all, Thomas remained exactly where he had been, as if time itself had no power over him. As the sun dipped lower, a final hush swept across the courtyard. Those who lingered noticed the way the light caught the polished barrel of his rifle, the way his shadow stretched long across the cobblestones. It looked less like a man and more like a monument, living proof that honor was not about bending to power, but about standing firm against it. For Thomas, there was no sense of triumph, only duty, only the steady breath of a man who had walked through war, carried loss, and learned that strength was not in aggression, but in stillness. Today, he had shown the world what that meant, and though he would never speak of it, though he would never break protocol to tell the story himself, others would carry it for him. Children would whisper about the guard who stood like stone. Veterans would tell their families that tradition was defended that day. And across the world, millions who saw the images would find themselves asking what it meant to stand firm when pressured to break. The Queen had left humiliated, the guard had remained silent, but history had been written not with words, not with weapons, but with stillness. That as the last of the crowd faded away, Sergeant Thomas Hale stood alone with the echoes of the day. His chest rose with a steady breath. His grip on the rifle was calm. The promise to James, to every soldier who had fallen, still lived in him. And as the shadows lengthened across the palace stones, his stillness whispered the truth the world now understood. Honor cannot be commanded, it can only be earned. In the end, it wasn't the roar of a crowd, the flash of cameras, or the weight of a crown that defined the moment. It was silence, the kind of silence only discipline can create, the kind that speaks louder than words ever could. What Sergeant Thomas Hale showed the world was simple. Tradition is not weakness, stillness is strength. In an age where noise drowns out meaning, he reminded us that sometimes the greatest act of defiance is refusing to move when pressured to bend. Camilla arrived expecting deference. She left with humiliation, and in her downfall, a lesson about her title, but about the man who never flinched. He carried within him the weight of fallen brothers, the discipline of centuries, and the quiet resolve that some things are too sacred to be broken for anyone. For those who watched, it wasn't just a guard standing still, it was the very idea of honor standing taller than arrogance. A child called him a hero, a colonel saluted him, veterans wiped their eyes, and millions online replayed the moment, seeing not scandal but a reminder that strength doesn't always need to shout. And maybe that's the story we need most today. That dignity is not granted by power, but earned by principle. That when tested, true honor doesn't cave to pressure, it endures. So the next time you feel pushed, mocked, or told to bend, remember the guard who didn't move. Remember the silence that shook the world. Remember that sometimes, stillness is the loudest statement of all. If this story moved you, share it. Let others see what honor looks like when it's tested. And if you believe in keeping stories of courage alive, subscribe to this channel. Because stories like these remind us, traditions live only as long as we pass them on. Tradition is not weakness, stillness is strength.